Dr. Tomlinson is Associate Professor of Leadership and Administration at Seminary of the Southwest. He holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University. He coaches and consults with Wall Street, Fortune 500, and high-tech startup executives and managers on leadership and communication strategy. He's a founding master teacher of the Acton School of Business for Entrepreneurship. He taught economics and finance at the University of Texas at Austin for 17 years, where he designed and directed the MBA Professional Development Program. He's also an accomplished playwright and performer. His award-winning solo shows have been produced in Austin and off-Broadway. And if I remember right, Stephen is giving us a little, more than a little piece of his birthday weekend, so we're especially appreciative of him joining us today. So Stephen, thanks so much for being with us this morning and bringing your unique perspective.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be with you all this morning. And I appreciate the challenge of looking at the world through your eyes for the past few weeks as I've talked to physicians and thought about this question of how we follow our calling at a time when all kinds of changes are putting pressure on what it is to be a physician and how it is that we do our work and serve in the world. And so I thought I'd reflect today on those questions through the work that I do with nowadays at the Seminary of the Southwest, helping people that are called to be ministers in a world where being a minister is more challenging than it's ever been. The work that I did at the Acton School of Business with people who wanted to be teachers in a time when both the demands for how people are formed, the expectations that we have of teachers to help students learn enough, quickly enough to do their jobs and follow their callings. And also that the work of education becomes more complicated as technology, economics, and culture change. And also what I've seen over the years, people who are called to be artists, how they make art and follow their calling to be prophets and poets in a society that sometimes doesn't allow that work to put bread on the table. How do you find a way to be true to the calling of your spirit when the circumstances in which you work are becoming increasingly difficult? So to prepare for this work, I did a little bit of interviewing with friends of mine that are physicians, and I asked them, what is it right now that's making this work more challenging? What is it that's changing in the environment that is putting extra pressure on those of us who are called to be healers, who are called to care for patients, who are called to bring science and medicine to the work of helping people get well and stay well? And so I thought I would invite you, before I share what came to me in these conversations, for you to put your own thoughts in the chat right now. What is it right now that is making it more difficult for us to follow our calling as physicians? What's changing right now in the economy, in society? What's changing right now in demographics, in the way medicine works, that is making it harder than it's been before for us to embrace our work as a vocation? So take a moment, and whatever it is that occurs to you as the thing that either in your own experience or in the experience of the folks that are your friends, the people to whom you are a mentor, or in your circles, what is it that's making this work challenging? And I'll tell you some of the things that I heard. It is more challenging because the economics of healthcare have put more and more emphasis on business processes and tasks like charting that take so much work, that there is technology that has to be engaged at all times, that the ratio of administrative work to time actually spent in the presence of patients, where the inspiration is increasing. And as that ratio changes, it just feels like there's more frustration and less energy in the work, not to mention the fact that the days stretch longer. Also, people are telling us that so if you prepared for medicine in order to work with folks that are healthier, and in fact, now we're seeing a whole new population of folks who are able to get healthcare, thank goodness, but perhaps don't get it through their work or through systems that otherwise support the maintenance of their health, then we have suddenly the new epidemics of more difficult health challenges to deal with, and patients that we know are sending home without much support in maintaining whatever progress they can make when they're in the hospital or in our practice under our care. The pandemic, of course, has brought all kinds of challenges, including shortages of staff, the challenges that come with adding protocols on top of what's already in the hospital, which makes it more difficult for us to be close to patients. It changes the way we communicate. All of us who've had consults on iPads with people, through protective barriers, this is an environment in which things are more challenging. And the fact that now there are more and more people coming into the hospital that are not invested in a scientific approach to healthcare, maybe not invested in scientific explanations for disease or treatment. And in some cases, they're bringing with them a lot of anger, which in most cases is misplaced, but directed at us for reasons that may not be easy to understand. On top of this, the pandemic has also changed us, that those of us that were already struggling with longer hours, changing practice, more technology, more difficult situations for care, are also experiencing changes in our own life. This has been a moment in history where people are doing a lot more stock taking and asking, what is it that I need to be spending my time doing? And how much inconvenience in the way my job works am I willing to put up with for the sake of being able to do those parts that are truly satisfying and meaningful? The moment to sit by a patient's bed or to talk with someone that we can encourage or counsel through a difficult medical decision, those moments may fill us with meaning. And how much charting, how much economic administrivia is it worth putting up with in order to have more of that? As we are taking stock and as we're moving through our lives, some of us are having children, some of us are caring for elderly parents, some of us are in this time finding ourselves called to be more present to our communities more directly. How are these changes in our lives creating stress on what we're willing to tolerate in terms of the extra friction at work, when in fact we see that there is a much greater need perhaps for our attention and our presence somewhere else? This is the kind of pressure I think that we find ourselves under in almost any profession. But it's hard to imagine that there's a place right now in our society where that pressure is more intense than it is for you all in healthcare. It's just not imaginable. As I watch the news and I see what doctors and nurses are dealing with, plus the nurses are getting a lot of love and celebration from their communities, whereas doctors are kind of just expected to grit their teeth and get through it. That somehow doesn't seem fair, but it's the expectation that society tends to put on the people who have MD after their names. As I look at this, it seems like a moment to ask the question, how do we think about following our calling at a time when all the cards are being reshuffled? Both the increasing pressure of the economic changes that have been underway for the past few decades, but also these new pressures that come with culture, that come with shock, and that come with big changes in our society that are underway. So what I'd like to share today is first a perspective on vocation, and next some practical and maybe sort of challenging ideas for how we make meaning when work gets harder and changes in unwelcome ways. The perspective is this, that vocation is a way of thinking about work that's very much akin to the relationship we have with our mate. You can think of your calling to work in the same way as you might think of your calling to marry someone or choose someone as your life partner. When I picked my vocation early in life, I had a very romantic attachment to it. I saw the difference that I desired to make in the world. I saw how my gifts might be useful to other people. I saw a way of being in the world that had dignity, that was creative and challenging, that gave me a place in society that came with respect and an opportunity to make a difference. Now, I had no idea how this was going to look later. I thought I was going to be a college professor, and being a college professor sort of solved that problem. And my attachment to that was exciting and passionate and very much like falling in love. Now, as I have lived out that attachment for the last 40 years, I've gone through lots of ups and downs with it, much as I have in my marriage. I have fallen in love with someone when I was young. I projected all kinds of fantasy and excitement and adventure onto them and onto who we could be together. And that has actually proven to be reliable. All that adventure has happened. All the good that I hoped for has happened, but almost none of it has happened the way that I imagined. And this seems to be the way bonded, committed relationship pays off for us in human life. You fall in love with someone without really knowing where that's going to lead and how that's going to play out and what the final fruit of that will be. And yet, if you are thoughtful in the midst of all the craziness of falling in love, if you do this in hope and you're committed to practice with it through the ups and downs, then for many of us, it turns out to pay off in some unexpected, significant, and very deeply satisfying way. And as I've thought about the way marriage works, vocation in some ways is similar. I am not married to a job. I left the University of Texas in 2004 after having been a professor there for 17 years because my vocation called me to somewhere else. And yet the idea that I had when I was in college of being an educator, of being someone who immersed himself in ideas that people were exploring and enriching together, being part of a conversation of discovery and experiment, and bringing that to serve other people that were looking for perspective and tools to solve problems. That's all still real. That's all still how, as a 60-year-old, I live and practice with my vocation. But along the way, there was all kinds of grief. There was the grief of entering an institution where teaching was being steadily undervalued and devalued by other pressures to compete as an institution on other dimensions around scholarship, around fundraising, around programs for vocational preparation. And I found that teaching was something that I was called to do and I was seeking to do in my environment without the full sort of support or valuing of that work. And yet I had to be true and discerned that I could and would be true to the vision that had drawn me originally to that job. And when I left the university and went with a group of friends to start our own business school, I continued to lean into the vision, the falling in love that I had done when I was 17 or 18. And as I expanded that work to go work with business people and take what I had learned as an economist to help them prepare for negotiations, to help them prepare for coming up with new ways of structuring their business to serve their customers better. I just kept leaning into what is it that I was trying to do that was going to be rich and satisfying, even when institutions weren't directly supporting it, and in some cases were opposing it. And so I want to encourage us when we're in the midst of frustration, when we are resentful that our institutions are putting priorities above the quality of care of patients, when it seems like there is very little support for us as whole human beings in something that can sometimes feel like a machine, when suddenly the door opens and the people that we are called to care for are bringing much more serious problems without a concomitant increase in resources available to us to meet their needs. I want to encourage you that whatever called you into medicine is still completely reliable, and that a faithfulness to that vision gives us a way to participate in what is trying to happen in the world, because it really isn't imaginable to me, as someone who is a occasional customer of the healthcare system and a beneficiary of your expertise, that we have actually found the very best way to organize care. This is still trying to work its way out. And so as we are struggling with how to be doctors, how to be researchers, how to care for patients in the institutions as they exist now, in the society as it is shaking and reshuffling right now, the resource that is most valuable is the call that we have to care, the call that we have to discover the truth, the call that we have to be present with people in suffering, and the call that we have to help make available to people the expertise and knowledge that has been collected by people with your training to help make life better for folks. So what does that look like on the ground? What might it look like? And I want to share with you some thoughts that I've adapted from the work that I do with teachers, pastors, and artists to see if some of this might perhaps be helpful to you. And I'm going to share for a moment a screen and tell a few stories, and let's see if this will happen. Cool. No, let me try it this way. Okay. I'm pulling the screen up now. Let's see if this is visible. Here we go. So here are the practices. If it's true, then, that our relationship with our calling is like our relationship with a mate, then it is a conversation. It is something that is spiritual. And it is not so much problem solving as it is a practice of intimacy. So these are the suggestions that I have received over the years that have proved reliable as I have sought to follow my calling when circumstances at work were changing. The first, and I've just put little shorthand labels on these. The stories came from other wiser people. The first question that I was asked is, when your work becomes frustrating, when things are hard, it is always helpful to ask, what part of me have I not been able to give to the work that I'm doing? I think it's easy for us to think first about how overworked we are, how overextended we are, how there's not enough time. And that may all be true. It certainly seems in your field with rising expectations that the amount of time required to check all the boxes and care for an increasing number of people that are more sick than they've been before, that is a very real time pressure. And the first question yet is a counterintuitive one. If I am exhausted, what part of myself is over here being left out and is unemployed? As a teacher at the university, I was frustrated because a part of me that helped connect the economics that I was teaching to the aspirations that my students had for the kind of work they wanted to do whenever they got their degree and were working for companies or starting their own business, I wasn't bringing my pastoral self to my work as a professor. And part of my exhaustion was simply the work that I was doing to cut off and restrain that impulse, that gift. That gift was left out of the work that I was doing. Now, it seems like a weird thing to say when I was feeling exhausted with grading papers, teaching too many classes, dealing with all of the other demands of being in an institution with a lot of reporting requirements, to say, why don't you try to bring more of yourself to work? And yet, lo and behold, there is this small thing, the pastor part of me, when I decided I've never thought of my job this way before, but I am going to teach as if I were a pastor, and I am going to teach as if I were a playwright. And these parts of myself that are powerful gifts, I am not going to restrain them from the work that I'm doing. And I want to invite you to imagine the possibility that the part of yourself that you've not yet been able to bring into this work will bring with it energy and refreshment and courage, and also spiritual resources to help you take some of the other steps that are required when we have to confront a situation that's changing in unfavorable ways. The second possibility for how we can engage this is to simply ask, what's enough? What is enough? When the outside world is piling more requirements on us, I found it helpful, and my friends also report that it's helpful, to practice small acts of resistance when you see that the system is moving in the wrong direction. And by this, I don't mean complaining. We'll talk in a minute about how the way we talk affects our experience at work and affects the experience for other people. But I want to know, if you suddenly put me in the hospital and told me, here are the requirements, I want to know what is enough. And I'm going to press you on that. Where can I actually cut corners? I am not going to try to do everything exactly right. Even if that creates some small risk, I'm going to figure out what risk am I willing to tolerate for the sake of channeling my energy where it truly needs to go. Now, notice, I am not advocating here that we act out, nor that we rebel. I'm simply saying that resistance in homeopathic doses is a spiritual practice. And part of resistance for us is going to be asking, what is enough? Now, y'all are like me. You are achievement-oriented, perfectionist people that probably earlier in your life got all A's and set any academic challenge and expectations, you rose to them. And I think when we have brought that formation into an environment where rules keep multiplying, it's healthy to have a sense of resistance that's not resentful, but rather empowered, and to be able to say with authority in our own hearts, this is enough with respect to this particular game over here, or this particular requirement, or this particular new experimental set of regulations and rules. I'm going to have to assess with intelligence which battles are worth fighting, but I want to give myself permission to resist in an empowered way where that's appropriate, without having to be rebellious, act out, or resentful. That resistance sometimes is the way in which we express the commitment of what matters most. Yes, there will be conversations about that, and those are conversations that we need to be in. The next thing that I've found to be really helpful when I'm dealing with a situation that's involves a lot of stuff that just seems onerous and hard is that the stuff that I have to do I am going to find some way to make it meaningful. Here's a silly, silly example. At my house, it seems like I take out the trash more often. And it's just because I don't want to smell the trash. And so it's going to happen, and I'm going to do it. And I realized one evening when I was on the way out with the bin that I did have a choice, which was I can keep fighting to make this work out the way I want to, or I can decide that since this is inevitable, I can make it significant. If it's something that absolutely non-negotiably has to be done, how might I turn this into an expression of love? How might I have the thoughts as I'm carrying this bin out that I am caring for someone that I love, that does so much for me, that this is just not, this is not the focus of anyone but me in the house. And since it is, I'm going to make this an opportunity for love. Now, that actually sounds nuts when you say it, because it's so much easier to resent the fact that nobody else wants to do it. And yet I found a lot of energy in crafting, carrying out the trash as a ritual. And I wonder, where is it that we in our work are doing things that have to be done, that are non-negotiable? Where is our capacity to connect the unavoidable with the essential? Can we make rituals to say, as I'm doing this administrative work, I could experience it as love for someone else? Now, by all means, if you can get out of something, get out of it. If this is something that must be resisted, then resist it. If it's something, though, that must be done, where is our capacity to make it something meaningful? The next possibility that I'm exploring here concerns a conversation I'm having with a lot of business leaders these days about empathy. It seems that so many of us are so spun up and angry and shocked with what other people are doing right now. And I really cannot imagine caring for people in the hospital that that will not be vaccinated, when in fact that would be the right thing for them and their families. It's hard to imagine people who deny the science about the pandemic. That's very difficult, especially for folks who are already at the breaking point in terms of the demands on their time and the environment in which they're working. That for me is unimaginably hard. I was thinking about this and thinking about my other friends who are in positions of authority in situations where people are completely acting in crazy ways. And I heard a story from a doctor that seemed significant to me. He said, when I am talking to a patient that is telling me things that are not true, but are obviously their way of dealing with their anxiety, I just try to remember that this person is doing the best they can, that they're doing the best they can. And at some level, what they're doing makes sense to them. Yes, in some cases, they're going to have to be contained. And no, I should not take seriously their medical advice or any sort of lies or conspiracies that they've been given in their vulnerability. But to just remember that people are doing the best they can, he said, frees me from just the constant grind of hateful resentment towards folks that are making the world worse. He then said something else. He said, I have found it helpful when I talk to these folks to kneel down and get my head below theirs. And that brings us to the next question, which has to do with, it seems like a lot of what's going on right now in our world has to do with an argument about authority or reaction against authority. We're trying to figure out what is authentic authority. And what he said is, when I kneel down and I take a patient's hand and I ask them, what are you afraid of? What are you scared of? What do you hope is going to happen? What kind of help do you need? he said, at that moment, more often than not, the temperature in the room starts to change, because no longer can they react to me as the person in the white coat that's standing over them with all the power, but instead they're more likely to see me as someone who's there to help, and maybe as scared of the wider world than as they are, but is going to be with them, is going to be present, and is going to care. And this understanding that he had, that right now the arguments about authority are really challenging us as teachers, as physicians, as ministers, as artists, to think about how we exercise authority or even reimagine authority in a way that's less about raw power and less susceptible to being perverted and twisted in these reactions where people are basically, parent-child screaming at someone because they're scared or have been neglected or mistreated. That our authority ultimately comes from the fact that we care. And it comes certainly from our knowledge, but really more from our presence, and that our knowledge becomes available to people if they are sure that we care and they can see that we're truly present. And this may go back to who's got time to be present in that way when there's so much to do. But I would encourage you to just experiment, as we're all doing right now, in whatever way you can, to let the person see that the authority that you're bringing into the room is one that respects their dignity, is not there to impose on them, and is not interested in any kind of games that are weird dynamics that are so readily available right now in every aspect of our lives. I think that it's really important when I am trying to follow my vocation in a world that's changing in difficult ways, that I'm paying attention to new opportunities for me to follow it. So when I became a professor, I kind of thought the University of Texas was really where you did it. But what I ended up discovering later was that with changes in technology that empowered me to share what I knew and create ways of teaching that could be more extensive, that I could actually do better work and more work in other environments, in a smaller, more nimble environment, or an environment that was differently equipped or differently permitted. And I think we're seeing some of this start to happen now in medicine. And I wonder if this isn't one of these moments when the changes in diagnostic and treatment technologies are going to allow more of us to change the way our day looks and our relationship with patients. And it probably is going to be a ways off, but we already see things happening on the frontier. And it is useful for us to go ahead and start imagining, what could the practice of medicine look like for me, or me and a few friends, in the world as it's trying to change right now? There are a lot of barriers to getting there: regulations, large-scale economics, who's got the power right now. But as one of my friends, who's a vegan rabbi, is fond of saying, I'm not vegan because it's going to save the world. I'm vegan so that I'll be ready when the Messiah comes. And I think we're not entrepreneurs because we're preparing to leave the hospital right now. We're entrepreneurs because we want to imagine what is the more beautiful medicine that's trying to happen, so that we're not afraid to lean in that direction as we see promising examples and bright spots of new forms of practice. So those conversations, I think, are helpful. And it's important that we are talking with our colleagues in ways that are forward-looking and optimistic, even when we're in the midst of the battle, to be able to, rather than getting stuck on complaint and commiseration and co-rumination and the ways of talking that sort of provide a quick hit of a sense of connectedness, but keep us sort of stuck in suffering, that it does help for us to practice encouraging one another to imagine, what could the world look like? What are we learning from this very difficult time about ourselves and what matters? And how might that learning take the shape of the new medicine that's trying to emerge? And what are we looking forward to? What are the things that we see happening that are exciting? None of this has to be reactive conversations about all the stuff that we resent. We can take that for granted. And I think we all know that. But even when we're in those conversations, if we can season it with a small bit of what can we imagine happening and being possible that we want to be part of, and what are we seeing and learning that's pointing to the future, if not even for us, for the folks that are training now, hopeful that medicine is going to be unfolding into richer potential in the next stage of life ahead. The final bit of advice for those of us who want to make sure that we are following our calling in a time when institutions may be less supportive, economic pressures and social currents are making everything harder, is, are we finding degrees of freedom that allow us to experiment with more courage and wholeheartedness? If I feel like that I absolutely cannot afford to take any risks with the job and the paycheck that I have right now, then I'm going to be in a state of fear and I'm just stuck there. The conversations with my colleagues that are encouraging might help me get the perspective to arrange to have degrees of freedom. But if you can, through the way you live and the way you structure your time, provide any sort of buffer or slack at all, then you get the perspective and the freedom and the courage to be able to travel a little lighter, to be able to speak more freely, to be able to experiment more smartly and more boldly. And part of this has to do with the little investments that we can make in our health and the little investments that we can make in our savings. But it also has to do with giving ourselves a degree of freedom around our expectations. I think those of us, if you've had children, you've been through this experience of realizing that this dream you once had of having everything and keeping it all together at a high level of performance and certainly it all looking neat is unsustainable. And maybe we can give ourselves the grace to say that as the world is changing in such big ways, that we have the freedom for things to be messy, and we have the freedom not to hold it all together. And we have the freedom not necessarily to know how this is going to work out. And the part of us that's been perfectionist, this may be the moment to send it on vacation or give it something else to do, because that is a critical degree of freedom for helping us to be adaptive, responsive, creative, courageous, when suddenly that kernel of calling that we know we bet our life on is still true. And the way in which it's going to take shape is going to be something surprising, much as our relationships have surprised us in ways that we didn't expect, but were actually perhaps exactly what we needed, and a beauty that we've grown to appreciate. I'll stop here and see what questions you might have or any comments that you'd like to make.